2021. How is your year starting out? It's interesting. New Year's comes and everybody makes resolutions, and you think it's a fresh new start. And within a week, we've already managed to take the wind out of our sails here in the United States, and what we thought might have been a fresh start hasn't happened. Today, we're going to talk about the 5 steps to effective crisis communications. Every year, people make resolutions, and I'm one of those guys who believes that 21 days into the month, most people have stopped working on their resolution. And that's why, in part, we waited until 14 days into the month before we decided to have this program so that you can kind of catch your breath from all the noise in the first 2 weeks of the year and then kind of get a good running start as to how to prepare for 2021. 2020 was probably one of the weirdest years you'll ever have in your life. The fact that the COVID crisis lasted all through the year, the fact that you've seen this phenomenon at which this is probably in my lifetime, the first time I've ever seen a crisis where everybody didn't work to end the crisis. If we see a house burning down, half the people don't say, please don't put any water on that fire, let it burn. If a house is burning down and people are inside dying, half the people in the crowd don't say, oh, just let those 5 people inside the house die. So we've seen through political turmoil and differences in the United States of America that it is more difficult than ever to talk to audiences when you are having a crisis. Your audiences are more skeptical. The people on social media are more vocal and volatile and more divided than ever before. And I know so many organizations depend on social media as their communications platform. I personally hate the heck out of social media as a crisis communications tool. From going back 2006 when I first spoke on this, and I know some of you were at conferences where I used the phrase tried and true beats shiny and new, I still believe that to be the case. So part of what we're going to go through today are some tried and true tools that will help you during the coming year. I'm going to share my screen with you. I will offer you all a replay with copies of the slides and handouts afterwards. And that way, if you want to do a teach back in your organization, you will have the slides that you can use as your own teach back. And then you will also have access to a video link, provided all the technology works and we get a good recording on this today. So we're going to look today at what I think are 5 steps that we can all use for effective crisis communications. My name is Gerard Braud. If you don't speak French, then it looks like Gerard Braud. But I have been working in crisis communications in some way, shape, or form all of my professional life. From 1979 to 1994, I was a TV reporter. I was digging through some old stuff and I found, look at that old glossy from my old TV days. I always call this my Ron Burgundy picture. From 1994 until today, I have been working in crisis communications. I've really been honored to be able to travel all over the world and work on 5 different continents, helping people stand up their crisis communications plans, to train their spokespeople, to do drills with them, and a lot of the stuff that we're going to talk about today. It's just been a real blessed life that I've been able to lead to help people, and we want to continue doing that with you here. Normally, we would all see each other a couple of times a year at conferences, and since that's not going to happen probably for another year, one of the things I wanted to do here was to start using Situation Hub as a sponsor for us to get together every month. So our objective is, this is the first what I hope will be a monthly get together. I'm going to try to put all of these in the first Thursday of the month. There is not going to be a sales pitch for anything. That is not my intent to try to sell you anything other than sell you on ideas and sell you on perspectives, really to hopefully motivate you to take action. If you need help, I'm always here to help you. You guys have known me long enough to know that my goal is to help you. but we're not selling anything here today. We're talking about best practices, and I want you to have some input as we go forward as to what else you want for content here. All of the replays of all the master classes will be on the Situation Hub blog. So if you go to situationhub.com/blog, which is where you all registered, that is going to be where you'll always be able to find content that remains evergreen. Crisis communications can be lonely, and I often refer to those of you who are passionate about crisis communications as those lonely crisis communications heroes. You get it. That's why you're here right now, because you get it. And many people around you do not get it. And because so many of them don't get it, you are seldom given the time or the monetary resources to do what you need to do. So whether you're trying to bring in someone to help you or whether you're trying to cram it into your daily schedule, you seldom are given those resources. I am just a huge believer in being prepared, which brings me to old photo that I found, number 2. This is me as a camp counselor, Eagle Scout back in 1973. And for those of you who have been in scouting, you know that the scout motto is to be prepared. And one of the things I have been asking a lot lately is how many people were in scouting. And I'm finding out that because the motto and is be prepared, and because both Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts were raised as youth in that environment, I am finding that the bulk of the people who are willing to do preparation in some way have a connection to scouting. That's not always true, but it is really cool when I find out, that's why that person thinks that way. So in the past month or so, as I've been chatting with friends and colleagues, I've been finding that is a trend. So whether you've been a scout or not a scout, you've come to the right place to let's get prepared for the coming year. In your effort to try to convince the people around you, whether it's your CEO or vice president that you report to, or even people who are your direct reports, as you're trying to convince them to let you do what needs to be done to prepare, I encourage you to use this analogy: umbrellas and fire extinguishers. You don't buy an umbrella because you hope it rains today. You buy an umbrella in case your sunny day turns into an ugly day. You're not buying it because you hope it rains. It's there because you are prepared. Likewise, all around your office, in your homes where you are for the Zoom, there are fire extinguishers somewhere in that building. You don't buy fire extinguishers because you hope there's a fire. You buy a fire extinguisher in case there is an accident. And crisis communications needs to be approached with that same mindset. Now, coming out of 2020 and this horrible year of not only the COVID crisis, but the crises upon crises. What I mean by that is COVID plus hurricane. I've had 5 times this year I've been hit by a hurricane. 8 times I have been in the cone of probability. 10 times I have had floodwaters in my yard. My home is built off the ground to account for floodwaters, but this has been a year of crisis upon crisis. Those out in California and Oregon and Washington on the West Coast, you had COVID plus flood. So many of you have had COVID plus some type of a protest or a riot or civil disobedience going on in your community. Winston Churchill essentially said, never waste a good crisis. Never waste a good crisis. And what I see from that expression is something I've talked about for years, which is the idea of every crisis is a time for you to learn, and it's a time for you to prepare, and it's a time to build your team. After Hurricane Katrina, I can tell by those of you on the call, some of you go way back with me to when the International Association of Business Communicators came to New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina to hold their international conference. And at that conference, I did a 1-hour presentation, and then we put everyone on buses I think we had 4 charter buses that we took into the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans and spent pretty close to 2 hours in the disaster zone, because in order to learn from that crisis, it is worth going to that scene. So I encourage all of you to use whatever your experience was in the past year or any prior crises as a roadmap and a reason and an excuse to prepare. Learn from the past so we don't repeat the mistakes. As I speak about crisis communications, here's the definition from which I speak. Any situation that has the ability to negatively affect the revenue, reputation, and brand of an organization. Something can happen that isn't a full-blown crisis, but it has the potential to be a crisis, and therefore it warrants your attention. Anytime a situation is emerging, my pathway, the suggestion that I have for you is that you open your crisis communications manual and you start following the directions in that manual, which includes gathering information, confirming the information, meeting with your internal teams, and preparing a statement. It doesn't mean that a statement will ever get released. And you've got multiple stakeholders depending on who you work for. The media may be a stakeholder, but quite honestly, your employees, I think, are your most critical stakeholder audience, because your employees have access to email and access to social media, and they can either share a truth or share rumors. But you've also got, for some of you, it's your customers or your stakeholders, depending on your organization. It could be your community. It could just be a whole host of things. So as we talk about crisis communications today, we're really talking about any situation that can damage revenue, reputation, and brand. And I want to call your attention especially to the word revenue, because in public relations classes, many people only talk about reputation management. And if you speak to executives who are focused on the bottom line, you should connect the dots fully to emphasize that it is revenue that is tied to the effect of the reputational damage and the damage to the brand. When you start talking dollars, you get greater attention. And in the world of crisis communications and public relations, people approach it from 2 different ways. And the word crisis communications does not mean the same thing to everyone. To me, crisis communications is the art and skill set of planning and then following those plans so that in many cases, the crisis never happens, or if the situation emerges to full-blown crisis, we reach the point at which we can mitigate it quickly. So it's proactive planning and preparation, it's proactive prevention, and it's proactive to be fast to mitigate whatever response you want the audience to take. Reactive crisis communications is when you have no plan, and after revenue, reputation, and brand have been damaged, you come in as a PR consultant and you try to put what is affectionately known as putting lipstick on the pig to try to make it look pretty. It can be done. Some people are really good at doing it, but I don't want you to have lipstick for a pig if you can keep the crisis from ever happening. It is far more costly to fix it after the crisis than it is to fix it before the crisis. I've been doing this since 1994. I can look at old invoices. The number of people who have come to me after a crisis to try to fix it, on average, have spent 4 times more than those who prepare for the crisis and have the tools that we're going to talk about today, who prepare for the crisis, and therefore they're trained internally to manage it on their own. So keep that in mind as we go into the content here. A big part of what I want you to realize in crisis communications also is you have the ability to manage expectations and to manipulate behavior. You have the ability to manage expectations and manipulate behavior. Effective crisis communications has the ability to move people out of harm's way. Effective crisis communications can mitigate crisis, and it can keep the crisis from cascading. I mentioned hurricanes a moment ago. That is a perfect example of when you can manage expectations and manipulate behavior. Let's say, for example, you work for a utility company, an electric company, or a cable provider. If a hurricane is hitting your area, or we're in winter right now, if a snowstorm, if a blizzard, I know there's weather moving across the country right now, high winds in the Midwest, if windstorms are moving across. Last year we had a derecho. If you know that bad weather is coming, you have the ability to start putting out statements 48 hours, 24 hours, 12 hours before the event happens, to tell them whether or not they're going to have a loss of creature comfort, to manage their expectations that you'll be without electricity, to be able to say that the storm may not kill you, but if you have the ability to evacuate the zone, do so. If you have a family member that you can stay with, if you have a shelter that you can go to, if you can afford a hotel. Because if you stay, your life may be really miserable. You'll be alive, but your life may be really miserable. If you have young children, if you have elderly parents in the house, if you have people who require respirators or oxygen generators, that's a reason to motivate those people to leave. Because if you don't motivate them to leave after the crisis, they're going to light up social media complaining that they don't have electricity, or they don't have cable, or they don't have internet. I've been that guy. Okay, this year, our electric company was doing a horrible job of not answering the phones, not responding. So I did what I teach people to avoid all the time. They were on social media. That's where I managed to get through to them. I essentially became the volatile customer that you don't want. So if you manage expectations ahead of time, then you don't have to fix it on the back end. Let me change slides here. Okay, so let's get into what those 5 steps of effective crisis communications are. In my world, and I know other trainers and experts take 5 steps, 7 steps, 12 steps. My 5, the big 5 for me, are number 1, doing a vulnerability assessment. We're going to talk in depth about each one of these in a minute. Number 2, not only writing your initial crisis communications plan, but making that plan a living document so that it is updated. I don't know how many of you follow PR Newswire or Caroline Sapriel out of Belgium, but I was on the phone with her yesterday. She had done a really great survey for PR Newswire that essentially said 65% of organizations claim they have a crisis communications plan. So that means 35% straight out say they don't have a plan. But out of the 65% who said somewhere there's a plan, the vast majority of them couldn't tell you where the plan is or what it says. And in this day and age, where a crisis can happen, and it's amplified immediately with videos and photographs and social media posts, there is no margin of error in this world for you not to have some sort of a crisis communications plan. We'll go in depth on that in a moment. Pre-written statements have been the secret sauce for every crisis communications plan that I have ever written. The concept of everybody I work with receives, on the day that we start working, about 100 pre-written, multiple choice, fill in the blank crisis communications templates. And we'll talk more about the nature of those in just a minute. Situation Hub is now a tool that actually automates the process of writing the news release. So whichever way you go in life, I want you to always have those pre-written statements. We'll talk more in a minute on that. Then training your spokespeople. It's interesting that many organizations will just wing it, and they don't predetermine who their spokespeople should be. They don't provide scripts from the pre-written library to their spokespeople. And what I have observed in life is that a single misplaced word can cost an organization hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of you have seen a video clip that I've shared in the past at some of my other workshops, where it's a spokesperson for a chemical company who is asked, will this plant pollute? Will this chemical plant pollute if you construct it? And he says, well, yes, we have a permit to make caustic chlorine, BDC, VCM, and PVC, and that permit is essentially a license to pollute. And that person been trained properly for an hour before walking out to do that interview, that person would have never said that. That one soundbite cost a $700 million project to get canceled, along with the 400 permanent jobs, the 4,000 construction jobs, and all the revenue and taxes that would have been paid to go to roads, schools, and other things. So I can't emphasize enough the importance of training spokespeople. Step number 5 is to conduct regular crisis communications drills. So let's take these apart one at a time. I am a fan of sprinting through each of these. Years ago, I used to do what most people do, which is collaboration, and it would stretch it out for 6 months to a year and a half. Many of you know what it's like in your organizations, because I hear from so many of you on a regular basis that you're trying to get something done and meetings get scheduled and postponed, or people just talk, and nobody actually takes a step. True story. 2004, I was deathly ill. I couldn't work for 6 months. For the 1 year prior to that, I had been collaborating with a very lucrative contract to build all 5 steps of effective crisis communications for a client. They were slow, they would do a little bit and put it off. And then we had 1 step left to do, and the client was going to make a single last payment to me. And a new vice president came in and wrote the email that trainers and consultants don't like. We're going in a different direction. On my deathbed, I needed that money desperately, and I got stiffed. They broke the contract, and I didn't have the money to enforce it. I was broke. I had 0 revenue for 6 months. I was living off of my savings. And it was during that moment that I said, we're going to consolidate this stuff. I can do steps 1, 2, and 3 in 2 days. And that's what I converted to as my model. What I essentially did during my recuperation period was I collected everything I had ever written for any company, and I found all the commonalities, and I built a mechanism. Whether you're working with me, working with a consultant, doing it yourself, sprint through it. If you are the person who has to write your own crisis communications plan, lock yourself away. Put fake meetings on your calendar so no one can send you a Zoom invitation. Do whatever you have to do to lock yourself away and sprint through the task. Be done with it as fast as possible. Go on a retreat, find a cabin in the mountains, whatever you have to do, sprint through these tasks. That is my suggestion, rather than letting things drag out. So let's tell you how to do all of this on your own. First step is you want to get a roadmap. And the way to build that roadmap is through a vulnerability assessment. If we know everything that could go wrong, then you can start building a plan that will work for everything. You can partner with other people within the institution, and it tells you which pre-written news releases will be most critical for your organization to have. So as you list out what could go wrong, list out all the predictable and ordinary things that would happen. So predictable and ordinary are going to be, every weather event and every natural disaster. Basic things like fires. Those are those predictable events. Then I want you to focus on the extraordinary events. So a workplace shooting may be an extraordinary event. Riots, if your business happens to be in one of those areas prone to civil unrest, regardless of what the cause of the civil unrest is. If you're in one of those areas, that is extraordinary because it shuts down your location. It damages your location. It forces you to move somewhere else. It forces you to evacuate people. That's what I mean when I'm saying extraordinary. Then there are the unspoken events. The unspoken events are usually those executive misbehavior events. So whether it's embezzlement, whether it's bribery, whether it's sexual harassment, any of those events that tend to be the things that you aren't told about in your role as a communicator. You want those on the list, and you want a mechanism to explore into those and to know the history and to have regular updates. You want to think about the bizarre events. One of my clients came to me because their bizarre event was that something really happened on the job that an employee took a picture of and put on social media. And it went viral in a very ugly way. It was in a rural community. It involved a dead animal. But the guy was a hunter. He didn't think anything about putting the picture out there. But once it was out on social media, it was no longer people in his rural community who are hunters who were used to seeing dead beast, even though this one was in an extraordinarily odd place that I won't go into. But the world saw it, and the world lit up their social media. So that's what I mean when I say bizarre. And then you always have to look at the new and changing. It's astounding how many organizations were not prepared for pandemics last year. From the very first crisis communications plan that I wrote in 1996, I've always included pandemic plus specific crises as they come on board. So that means I've been through the SARS crisis, the N1, H1, avian flu, bird flu, and so many organizations were making it up as they go. Your vulnerability assessment needs to happen in two ways. One, big assessment. You can start doing it on your own. You can collaborate and go to other people throughout the organization and say, what would you add to this list? Ask at the upper level because they see things that you don't see. Ask at the lower level because the guy in the mailroom sees things that the folks in the C-suite don't see. If the guy in the mailroom says, oh yeah, at least twice a month we get an envelope full of white powder, well, that's an anthrax scare. It might be talcum powder. It might be somebody putting flour in it just because they don't like you. But the fact is, if there are powdery substances coming into the mailroom and the mailroom doesn't have an air system to evacuate those fumes, you've got a potential crisis. Once you do your big basic crisis assessment, your vulnerability assessment, my prescription for you is to meet once a month for 15 minutes. 15 minutes will change your life if you get together with your team once a month. I used to, prior to 2020, prescribe get together once a quarter. But as long as we're still in this current volatile environment that is the pandemic, and you're going to be dealing with it at least for 12 more months in some way, shape, or form. As you see, the vaccine rollout is becoming a crisis itself because of planning that wasn't done or the failure to plan. So let's imagine that 2020 is going to be a more optimistic version. Let's say 2021. 2021 is going to be a more optimistic version of 2020. We're seeing light at the end of the tunnel, but spend at least 15 minutes a month on the phone with those who know what crises could emerge, because you're going to have crisis on crisis, right? Potentially, you can prevent a crisis from happening if it shows up on the list. So the example that I showed you, that I spoke about a minute ago, the example I spoke about with dust in the mailroom, powder in the mailroom. If you know that happens, you can, through your vulnerability assessment, say, hey, we need a mechanism in the mailroom to make sure that envelope dust doesn't get in the mailroom, but that it's evacuated through a ventilation system. That keeps that crisis from ever happening. If it's a crisis that you can't avoid, then it allows you to better plan for that crisis. And therefore, it allows you to build the mechanisms to respond to that crisis. In your crisis planning, I want you to be aware of roadblocks. The biggest roadblock is the inability to find out what is actually happening with the crisis. One of my early crisis communications clients was a global corporation, and they were based in a home office in the US, and they had operations in foreign countries, very remote locations. Sometimes at the home office, it was 2 weeks before we found out what happened in this remote jungle location. The way we found out 2 weeks later was generally when an international reporter would phone the home office to ask for a comment. To this day, it is still a problem, even if you only have one location, to find out from people within the institution what happened. And that's because people are afraid that they will be blamed for whatever the crisis is. So therefore, as you're doing your vulnerability assessment and you find out who owns the particular crises, what department, make friends with those people and create a safe environment for them to come to you and say, hey, we've got something going on. So what we now have to do is help you build a way to convey the information to the crisis management team and the crisis communications team, and create a way for you to produce a statement quickly. Whether you release the statement or not, have it loaded and ready to go. We need a mechanism by which you can get that statement approved quickly and a way to get it to the stakeholders quickly. So as I've evaluated this, I've come up with the concept of what I'm going to call the crisis communications funnel. And I'm going to show you the funnel, and I want you to ask what is working for you and where do you have a clog in the funnel. As I show you the funnel, I'm going to apologize for the small type, but I'm going to promise you that I will give you this as a digital download after the event. But without reading all the nuances of what is on here, at the top layer, we want to think of that as the situation source. Where is the crisis coming from? Is it with your customers and stakeholders? Is it operations, production, manufacturing? Is the crisis coming from human resources? Is it coming out of finance? Is it a weather or natural disaster event? Is it with the CEO or some level of the C-suite? Is it coming out of your engineering department? Is the crisis coming from social media? Because social media now has the ability to generate a crisis. Is it coming from IT? So you have to look at whatever organization you belong to think of all the sources, the departments, where that information is going to come from. Then we have to find out who learns about this first, and who do they tell, and how do they transmit that information. Then in the third level, we have to figure out, is there a mechanism for you to get that information? Is there a mechanism to alert the crisis management and the crisis communications team that there is a problem? Then you have to be able to gather the crisis management team and the crisis communications team together to evaluate the situation. That group then empowers the crisis communications team to then write a statement, authorize the statement, and then get it out to whatever stakeholder groups you have. Again, employees, media, customers, your community, social media, other stakeholders. So I will make this available for you. But the way to solve that is through your crisis communications plan. The details of every aspect of that funnel will go into your plan. The more specific, the more terrific. Too many plans say someone should gather information. It doesn't assign it to anyone. It just says someone should. It says someone should release a statement, or many plans that I've evaluated for companies will say, consider whether a statement should be written. And that's all it says. Who considers it? It doesn't say. How fast do they consider it? It doesn't say. By specific and terrific, I mean that you should say, these are the steps that you take, chronological order. This is who does them. This is how we contact that person. And this is how fast the task must be completed. In every crisis communications plan that I've ever written, I tell people you have 1 hour or less from the onset of the crisis to communicate to the outside world. And I know that 1 hour is super fast because most companies take 3 hours and 30 plus minutes, sometimes 4 hours before a statement goes from the flashpoint of the crisis to the time it's released. 1 hour is still too long. It's super fast for some organizations. 1 hour is 59 minutes too slow compared to Twitter and Facebook Live and any other live platform that we have, or any other social media platform that we have. It's 59 minutes too slow. Your goal is to find out, how can I make a plan move almost at the speed of social media? So you don't want just checklist. You want true details of who does what, when they do it, exactly how they do it, and a time limit for accomplishing that task. That makes for a much more terrific plan. Now, as we speak about plans, I do want to touch on the idea. Let me go back one slide. As we talk about plans, I want to also emphasize that the word crisis plan is a generic phrase that doesn't always mean the same thing. Some organizations have emergency operation and incident command plans that they generically call their crisis plan. That manages a horrible crisis, that tells you how to put water in a certain type of fire, or how to manage what is usually a disaster or a potential disaster. Other plans are business continuity plans that helps keep the supply chain running. So people call those crisis plans. The communications plan, the crisis communications plan, specifically tells you how to gather information, how to confirm information, and how to disseminate that information. The incident command plan, there is a different variation of that plan for every type of disaster. Business continuity plan, there is a different version of that plan for every type of disaster. The crisis communications plan needs to be the same for every crisis, and the variable for you becomes your pre-written statements. Gathering information, confirming information, disseminating the information. It's like washing your hair and reading the label in the shampoo bottle. It says lather, rinse, repeat. And that is the job of the communicator. I want your plan to be so specific and so thorough, yet so easy to follow that anyone with the ability to read could pick it up and execute it. That is not ultimately what we want, but I want it to be built in that genre that it is simple enough to execute. Now, the secret sauce for me is having a library of pre-written news releases. I have been in war rooms with too many organizations where I watch this grueling, exhausting version of people trying to approve a statement. Suddenly, accountants become Pulitzer Prize winning writers. Suddenly, lawyers don't want anything said. Everybody in the room who reads your statement wants to make an edit. And we have to stop the madness. Please stop the madness. I've watched adults fight over commas for 30 minutes. It's just outrageous. It just drives me nuts. Here's what normally happens. You sit at a computer, or someone at your organization sits at a computer, looks at a blank computer screen, and starts typing. And regardless of how great of a writer you are, it will still take you 30 minutes to 45 minutes to get something that you like, because even you will over wordsmith what you're writing. And then you think it's beautiful. And then you take it in and people take out these red pens and then they mark it all up. And then they send you back for draft two. You bring in draft two and they mark it up again. And valuable time is wasted. Your revenue, your reputation, and brand is being annihilated by employees, by social media. Depending on the crisis, the media are filling the void with speculation. But if you have a pre-written news release, multiple choice, fill in the blank, benign sentences, it allows you to hit the delete key and take away what you don't want in order to produce the statement that you need. And every word can be pre-approved so that people clearly know what it's going to look like. Writer's ego has to be put aside, okay? If you have an ego as a writer, and I do, and I know many of you do because some of you are really good friends, it says that we want to really write something profound. Save that for another time. What you really need to be writing here is a news story that you can put out with the who, what, when, where, why, and how without speculating as to the why or the how. And it needs to be short staccato sentences. I've got hundreds and hundreds of these statements that I use. And I can tell you most of them don't, most of the sentences do not have commas. They're short staccato sentences. And in Situation Hub, which is the software system that I built, it's the same thing. I've essentially taken 20 years worth of documents and automated them to where it automatically writes a news release with short staccato sentences that are numbered so that if you need to use it as a script at a news conference, the numbers are there. It helps the spokesperson follow along. And then when you're ready to publish the statement, you take away the numbers, it looks pretty, you copy and paste the content onto your website, and voila, you now have communications at a faster speed. So whether you're using something like the traditional Word documents, you should be able to get that out probably in 15 minutes to 30 minutes, depending on the complexity of your organization. So it's going to greatly speed up what you do. You can predict what's going to happen. You can write statements that anticipate every question you need to answer. All right, that's step number 3. Step number 4 is training your spokespeople. They need to be trained on how to use the scripts from your library of pre-written news releases, or for those of you who are already using Situation Hub, they need to be trained to use the script that Situation Hub generates. Reading a script is different when you're media training people on how to ad lib through a statement or ad lib the events of a crisis. A good statement pre-answers the questions the media will ask, which means after you read the statement, there will psychologically be, and in reality, it's a psychological mechanism I use, by pre-entering the questions, there are fewer questions after you've read the statement. Because we know that the more a person ad libs, the more likely they are to say something accidentally that will damage their revenue, reputation, and brand. And that's what we don't want. So when you're training spokespeople, even though you generally think of it as media training, what they say works for the media, but it also works if they're talking to the board, if they're talking to their employees, if they're talking to the community. The speaking skills you learn are invaluable. Your ability to learn to answer a question and always provide context is so important. So in addition to training the top people, you want to train the communications department, you want to train some subject matter experts. And depending on the type of organization you have, you need to train at least the president of the board. Many people ask, well, who should be our spokesperson in a crisis? Different organizations have different rules. Some think the organization should speak with one voice and only one person should have that voice. And they think it should be the CEO. I say the CEO is the last person to speak for 2 reasons. If the CEO goes out first and misspeaks, who will come behind them to clean up the mess? Number two, if the CEO speaks on something that is minor, it makes it seem like a bigger crisis. If the CEO speaks on something minor, it makes it seem like a bigger crisis. My first choice is somebody with public relations communication skills goes out with what I call a first critical statement. If it's going to be an ongoing crisis where you might issue one, two, or three statements during the course of the event, first person out the door is the PR person who is well trained. And the reason for that is that's their job. And number two, the executive team, the C-suite, the crisis management team, really at that point, early in the crisis, should be inside the command center managing the crisis. If your job is to manage the crisis, do not try to manage the media. If a second statement is necessary, and if it rises to the level at which you're facing an audience of employees or media or community, whoever it happens to be, or even if you're doing it virtually on Zoom or virtually through a YouTube statement, because YouTube statements are an excellent tool. YouTube statements are an excellent tool. A subject matter expert is my second choice for the spokesperson. And then if it is a tragic event that involves anyone who is missing, anyone who is injured, or heaven forbid, fatalities, the CEO will come out at some point as the ultimate conveyor of empathy. And if it is your fault, and lawyers cringe when I get to this part of the explanation, but if it is your fault, to make the appropriate apology or contrition for that. Now, lawyers freak out because, of course, they don't want you to say it was your fault because you give fuel to plaintiff's attorney, and you've all heard that argument before. But in some way, you need to own what happened, and you then need to announce what plans you will have in place to get beyond it or to make good on it or whatever else is necessary. So that is step 4. And step 5 is on a regular basis to do crisis communications drills. Both media training and drills present an opportunity for you to mess up in private so you don't mess up in public. Both allow you to test elements of your plan, because in media training, you'll use pre-written statements from your script. In the crisis drill, you will test your spokespeople, and your drill is designed to also test the elements of your plan to make sure your plan actually works the way you think it will, to make sure the members of your team are on board and that somebody doesn't go off and try to freestyle. I always call the freestylers the Alexander Haig syndrome. Those of you who are old enough like me to remember the day that President Ronald Reagan was shot, Alexander Haig, who was Secretary of State, a former general in Vietnam, walks to the podium in the White House and says, "I'm in charge here." When clearly the crisis communications plan that Thomas Jefferson and the other founding fathers wrote said, no, you're actually several people further down in line. I think you're 5th in line. The vice president's in charge here. And then the Speaker of the House and Speaker Pro Tem of the Senate. Secretary of State, you're number 5. So what you find out in your drill sometimes is who tries to take control when they should not be taking control. As you build your drill, as you write the scenario, it was funny because I have one client that I do this for probably every 2 years. We do a really super extensive drill. And I was talking to her. I'm actually doing a master class with her in 2 hours. And she was saying, we decided that we would write our own drill and see if we could do it. And we realized that it took us a month to write it. And the answer is, yeah, it takes a long time to write it. You have to write a drill scenario like a murder mystery. And there has to be lots of misdirection. You almost have to be psychotic to write that. And it always frightens me when I write these things and I go, oh, there is a portion of me that is dark and deep, because I think of some evil things in these drills. During your drill, have at least 2 news conferences with questions and answers and cameras. Don't make it silly, make it realistic. Test those spokesperson. And again, create that opportunity to mess up in private so you don't mess up in public. After the drill, you have an evaluation and you make edits to your plan. And sometimes you make edits to your staff and your team members based on what you learn. That, my friends, is going to wrap up the content. I am going to give you an opportunity to ask questions both here for the next few minutes, as well as to schedule time for me. So you see that Calendly link right there on your screen. Write it down. I didn't change the slides. It says subscribe by October 14th. Ignore the subscribe. That was from a previous presentation, apparently on October 15th. But if you want private time to do a discovery call because you want to talk about confidential things you don't want to talk about here, by all means, schedule that time with me. I am now going to stop sharing. I'm going to come back full screen here, and let's find out if you have any questions. There is a chat mechanism there where you can ask questions, or you can like wave at me, or you can just go, hey, Gerard, I got a question. So I'm going to change to gallery view. Wave at me if you want me to unmute you so you can ask a question. Miles, I see you're unmuted. Do you have a question? All right, let's see. You mentioned numbers. I'm reading here from the chat. You mentioned numbers in the pre-written statements. What do the numbers reference? Every sentence that I write in a pre-written statement, I put a number next to it in the templates that I have. So both in the Word documents that I have and in the Situation Hub application, when the statement is first generated, the paragraphs are numbered. And in part, that's so that you can yell across the office, hey, kill sentence number 3, or go down to sentence number 5. It's instead of 3 people injured, it's 2. And it allows you to make those edits fast. And then when you're at the podium reading, you know that you've done sentence 1, sentence 2, sentence 3. And let's say sentence 5 is the golden sentence that deflects speculation. So sentence 5 may say, it would be inappropriate for us to speculate on what happened. We will wait for an investigation to tell us what happened, how it happened, and how we keep it from happening again. If that's sentence 5 or sentence 8, whatever it is, I'm going to circle that one, because when I get to the question and answer portion, most of the questions will be about speculation, and I want the eyes of my spokesperson to go back to paragraph 8 or whatever they circled. So that's why I use that. It's a mechanism for editing fast when you have to scream across the office, or you simply need to go, instead of counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it just makes editing faster. All right, good question. Next question, Daryl. What should the chemical plant spokesperson have said? The chemical plant spokesperson should have begun with a preamble. In every news release that I write, there is a preamble. In every Situation Hub scenario, there is a preamble, and it adds context to what is about to be said. When we evaluate people after they do a news conference or an interview, most will complain to me that they were taken out of context and their best stuff was left on the cutting room floor. Regarding context, I always say, well, did you provide context? And they say, well, nobody asked me for any context. It is your job to provide context. And the way to do that is in the opening sentence. So if we're in a media training class, I would tell you that most people fear not knowing what the first question is. You don't have to fear the first question if you know how the answer will begin. And I'm not talking about spin, but I'm talking about having a phrase at the ready that you can use. So specifically, if this spokesperson had been asked, will this plant pollute at all? He would have started with a preamble that says, well, in order for us to build this facility, we have to promise to be protective of human health and the environment. We have to protect the air, we have to protect the land, and we have to protect the water. So let me tell you about the mechanisms that we have in place to do that. And where the spokesperson made the mistake is he was an analytical individual who I knew in that analytical mind, when I watched him say it, was thinking everything pollutes, right? If I exhale, I'm polluting. If I cook on the stove, I'm burning natural gas or electricity, that's polluting. If I drive a car, I'm polluting. If I brush my teeth and spit, I'm polluting. So in his mind, he thought, well, yeah, everything pollutes. We're going to pollute. And that cost him $700 million. So a preamble is the secret. That is like the biggest revelation probably in the 40 years that I've been doing this, when I realized the power of the preamble. It also helps you focus. It's a starting point. It adds context. And if you are in trouble, if you get that deer in the headlight moment during the interview and you're lost for words, you should have that internalized in your heart to where you can instinctively go back and say, and as I mentioned earlier, it's our responsibility to be protective of human health in the environment. So let me tell you, and then answer the rest of the question. So it's a mechanism that helps the brain communicate more effectively. Do not spin, don't put BS in the preamble, make it really solid. And if a crisis is happening, realize that the preamble also should call out what the crisis is. In the preamble, please never use the word our top priority. I don't want to hear anybody ever say safety is our top priority. When I was a reporter, I'm still a very cynical person, but imagine how cynical I was as a reporter. And the spokesperson standing in front of the burning chemical plant says, well, here at XYZ Chemicals, safety is our top priority. And I wanted to go, clearly not, Sparky. I see black smoke and flames coming from over your head. Windows are broken for 100 homes. Safety was not your top priority. But if that spokesperson says one of our goals is to have a safe workplace and to conduct a workplace that is safe for our employees, contractors, visitors in our community. Unfortunately, today, we have had a significant event happen to which we are responding. This is what we can confirm. At 9 o'clock this morning, we experienced a fire and explosion, and then go down the list of all the things that are in either the pre-written news release or the news release from Situation Hub. But the words, the preambles are all there. Good, Dara? All right, good seeing you. Next question. Robert, what are you still doing up at this time of the day from overseas there in Cyprus? Thanks. Excellent presentation. Oh, he'll be in touch tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Bill, good to have you around, my friend. Bill's always in the front row anytime we're at a conference together. What do you advise if a change in management occurs at the same time of the crisis? Management changes are always tricky. And that's why if you are bullish and really own the plan, when the new boss comes in, your job is to get time on the calendar to orient them to it. If it's in the middle of the crisis, you simply say, hey, boss, stand back. I got this. Here's the plan. You can follow along because I have 3 copies, right? Plans live in at your desk in your office. A plan lives at your nightstand, and a plan lives in a clear plastic bag in your trunk so that you can get to it. Say, boss, stand back. All right, Carol, you like the idea with the numbers. That's awesome. Daryl's got to go. Thanks for the advice. And who else has a question? If there are no more questions, we will wrap up this event. I'll share the final slide one more time. Don't be shy. I'm not going to sell you anything if you call. Let's talk, okay? Let's answer those questions in private. If you are not familiar with Situation Hub, then by all means, go to Situation Hub. There are a bunch of tour videos up there. If you want to sprint through any parts of crisis communications, my friends, I am here to help you sprint through that. There is not a single thing on that list of 5 things that we can't get done in a single day. That's primarily because I did your homework for you. So it's a matter of just customizing things and standing it up and getting them ready. So here's our goal. Let's all meet back here. First Thursday of the month. We'll do it at 11 o'clock in the morning. You can send me any suggestions you have for future topics. I know social media is always a big topic, and I plan on bringing in some social media experts. On the next class, I'm going to have some recordings from the interview I did yesterday with Caroline Sapriel from Belgium about her survey. I'm trying to track down my friend Jay Bear, who is quite the social media guru, so that we can talk about the benefits versus the disadvantages of social media. I will tell you that just right off the top here, if you post something on social media, people will troll you. If you put a full statement over on your website with a link from Facebook that makes them get off of Facebook and go to your website, it is harder for them to type a snarky comment. That being said, it has been a pleasure to spend this time with you. You will get an email from me later today or tomorrow with a replay and a link to download the slides and a link to download the PDF of the crisis communications funnel. I hope that you have a successful year, but the main thing I want you to do is make a commitment to be prepared and to stay prepared. This is Gerard Braud saying, be well. Talk with you soon.